Imagine a country whose ships crossed the oceans faster than desert caravans, a land where maps had no blank spaces and gold was bought up by the kings of Europe. In the 16th century, Portugal ruled half the world from Brazil to India, controlling trade, gold, and spices. It was never the largest empire, but it was the first to conquer the ocean. Its armies were small, yet its flag flew from Japan to Africa. The Portuguese dominated the seas so completely that even the Chinese paid them tribute for the right to trade in their own waters. But if Portugal once owned half the world, why is its territory barely visible on a map of Europe today? This wasn't just bad luck. The country destroyed its own future, all because of one fatal mistake. But before we get to what went wrong, let's first understand how tiny Portugal managed to command half the world, because its rise was just as astonishing as its fall. At the beginning of the 15th century, Portugal was a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, wedged between Spain and the Atlantic Ocean. On the surface, it had no chance of global dominance, but the Portuguese had one advantage no other nation possessed: the sea. While other European powers fought over land, Portugal set its sights on the ocean. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, its ships were the first to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and venture toward unknown shores. They discovered the islands of Madeira and the Azores and became the first Europeans to reach the west coast of Africa. With each new route, their influence grew. Portuguese explorers carved out new trade networks stretching across Africa, India, and even Japan. But their most valuable discovery lay ahead: gold, spices, and slaves that would make Portugal unimaginably wealthy. But wealth always comes with a price. Portuguese ships returned from distant voyages with their holds overflowing with gold, spices, and slaves. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, commodities worth more than silver in Europe, now flowed into the ports of Lisbon. Portugal had become the world's leading trading power. Soon, it controlled not just the supply, but the entire logistics chain. Indian spices, only through the Portuguese. African gold, not without their mediation. Money poured in, and Portugal spent lavishly on grand palaces, a powerful navy, and ever more expeditions. It seemed like the wealth would never run out, but the more territory they controlled, the harder it became to manage. The administration struggled, corruption spread, and the king in Lisbon gradually lost track of which lands even belonged to the crown. And that's where things get interesting: how Portugal became hopelessly entangled in its own empire. Imagine the office of the Portuguese king. Maps are scattered everywhere. Long scrolls list the names of countless colonies, and royal officials struggle to balance the books. Right, India, Africa, Brazil. Wait, what's this territory? The Maluku Islands, Your Majesty. We conquered them? Yes, about 10 years ago. And what's there? Cloves and a bit of gold. Excellent. Who's in charge? No one. The king glances around in confusion as his advisors exchange nervous looks and quickly cross the islands off the list. All right, moving on. We're covering all the expenses, right? Well, there were some issues with India, but we wrote them off as unexpected costs. Unexpected? It's an entire continent. While European rulers spent weeks approving a single decree, Portugal was acquiring new lands faster than the king could keep track of them. But administrative chaos was just the beginning. Soon, Portugal would face far greater problems. While Portugal basked in the riches of its colonies, other European powers were watching closely. Spain, the Netherlands, and England quickly realized that the ocean was full of opportunities. Once the undisputed ruler of the seas, Portugal now found itself in a fight to keep its throne. The Dutch launched aggressive attacks on Portuguese trading posts in Asia. Their fast, maneuverable ships crushed Portuguese ports, seizing key trade routes. Meanwhile, the English turned their attention to the Atlantic, threatening Portugal's hold on Brazil. As for Spain, rather than offering help, it started eyeing its weakened neighbor for itself. But the biggest problem? Unlike Portugal, its rivals were building strong economies and powerful fleets, while Portugal relied entirely on colonial wealth without investing in a solid foundation at home. And then came the mistake that sealed its fate. It placed its trust in Spain. In 1580, Portugal made a fatal mistake. After King Sebastian's death, the country was left without an heir, and Spanish monarch Philip II seized the opportunity, declaring himself the new king. On paper, Portugal retained its autonomy, but in reality, it was swallowed by Spain. At first glance, An alliance with powerful Spain seemed beneficial, but in practice, it was a disaster. While Spain waged wars across Europe, it drained Portuguese resources and used its fleet, all while neglecting the defense of Portugal's colonies. The Dutch, English, and French quickly realized that Portuguese territories were now virtually unprotected. What followed was outright plunder. The Dutch took parts of Indonesia, the British tightened their grip on India, and Portuguese trade routes became easy prey for pirates. After 60 years under Spanish rule, Portugal had lost nearly half of its empire, and by the time it finally regained independence, its former glory was already out of reach. In 1640, Portugal finally broke free from Spanish rule. After decades of humiliation and loss, the country's elites rose up in rebellion, restoring the throne to a national dynasty. It seemed like Portugal was ready to rebuild and reclaim its former greatness. But in those 60 years, the world had changed. While Portugal struggled for independence, its rivals wasted no time. The Dutch took Indonesia, the British pushed the Portuguese out of India, and French and English merchants took control of Atlantic trade. Even Brazil, Portugal's main source of gold, now served British bankers, who controlled its trade and credit. Once, Portugal had ruled half the world. Now, all that remained were scattered fragments of a once mighty empire, and the most ironic part? Even the Portuguese themselves could no longer keep track of what was still theirs. Lisbon, the king's office. Around the table, Portuguese officials sit buried under maps and lists of colonies. The mood, utter confusion. All right, gentlemen, let's get this straight. How many colonies do we actually have left? Well, we still have Brazil. Good. What about India? That's complicated. The British are there, but technically, we still own something. Technically? Yeah, kind of like that one spoon in the office kitchen. Technically, it's for everyone, but the same people always use it. The king sighs and flips through the list. Fine. Indonesia? Nervous glances around the room. The Dutch took it. Africa? The French. All right, but here it says Macau. What even is that? It's somewhere in Asia, but we think it's still ours. The king slowly sets down the papers. Are we sure we sent people there, or did they just forget to come back? The room falls into tense silence. But soon, the Portuguese would have no time for jokes, because disaster was about to strike that would change the country forever. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, Lisbon woke up to an ordinary day. People filled the streets, heading to church for All Saints' Day, while merchants and townsfolk went about their business. But at 9:40 a.m., the ground began to shake. One of the most devastating earthquakes in European history had begun. Buildings crumbled into dust, churches, palaces, markets, all reduced to rubble. Panicked crowds rushed into the streets, desperate to escape, but minutes later, a massive tsunami crashed into the city, sweeping away what little remained. Then came the fires, engulfing the last surviving districts in flames. Over 60,000 lives were lost. Lisbon, once one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, lay in ruins. This disaster was more than just a tragedy. It marked a turning point in Portugal's history. And even as the capital began to rebuild, the country could never reclaim its former glory. The earthquake of 1755 didn't just destroy Lisbon, it shattered Portugal's economy. Rebuilding the capital required enormous resources, and while the country poured vast sums into reconstruction, it failed to invest in industry or strengthen its military. Meanwhile, Britain and France were growing ever more powerful, but Portugal remained stuck in the illusion of its former greatness. The gold from Brazil was no longer enough to cover its losses, and global trade routes were increasingly dominated by other nations. By the late 18th century, Portugal was no longer seen as a great empire, and its once mighty fleet had fallen behind, giving way to British dominance at sea. The country struggled to hold on to its colonies, but the odds were against it. And soon, it would lose its most valuable jewel, Brazil. By the early 19th century, Brazil was Portugal's last truly valuable colony. Its plantations, gold, and slave trade provided the bulk of the kingdom's wealth. But Europe was changing, and the wave of revolutions had finally reached South America. In 1707, fleeing from Napoleon, the Portuguese royal court relocated to Rio de Janeiro. For the first time in history, A colony became the temporary capital of its empire. But when the danger passed and Portugal tried to reassert control over Brazil, it was already too late. The local elites had gotten a taste of independence. In 1822, Prince Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne, simply declared that Brazil was no longer part of Portugal. No war, no negotiations, just a straightforward "Cielos, we're our own country now." And Portugal, it was powerless to stop it. This was the end of the empire. And how did Portugal react to losing its child? So, Brazil sits on the couch with a suitcase. Portugal paces nervously around the room. "You're really leaving?" "Yeah, Mom. I mean, Portugal, I've grown up. It's time to start my own life." "But we have so much in common. We speak the same language." "Sure, but you still treat me like a servant. I invested so much in you. Who built all those roads and cities? And who took my gold for 200 years? Okay, what if I give you a little more freedom?" "It's over, Mom. I'm moving out." Brazil walks out, leaving Portugal standing in an empty room, staring helplessly at the globe. But why did Portugal lose all its influence so easily, unlike other empires? Unlike Britain or France, Portugal built its power solely on its colonies. It never developed industry, strengthened its military, or created a stable economy. While other empires invested in technology and production, Portugal simply drained resources from its territories. So when the colonies started breaking away, the country plunged into crisis. Without the steady flow of gold and spices, the economy collapsed. The once mighty fleet was outdated, and the army was too weak to defend what remained of the empire. As a result, Portugal quickly lost its status as a global power. It could have remained a dominant force in the world, if only it had taken a different path. But what if Portugal had managed to keep its empire? What if Portugal had held on to its empire? Today, it could have been one of the most powerful nations on Earth. Imagine Brazil, India, Africa, Indonesia, all still under Portuguese rule. Vast resources, strategic trade routes, influence across every continent. With such dominance, Portugal could have competed with the US, China, and Russia. But in reality, this was never possible. A massive empire required a strong military, a developed economy, and political stability. Portugal was too reliant on raw materials, and without industrial power, it simply couldn't maintain control over its territories. So what really happened? The great naval empire lost an entire world. Imagine having the whole world and ending up with just a small corner of Europe. Once, Portugal ruled lands from Brazil to Japan. Its ships dominated the oceans. Its gold fueled global trade. But it never strengthened its economy, never built an industrial base, and relied too heavily on its colonies. Spain swallowed it up, England and the Netherlands took its trade routes, and Brazil left without a fight. In the 16th century, Portugal was a global superpower. Today, it's a small European nation. The great empire lives on in history, but not on the map. Portugal is a perfect example of how even the most powerful empire can vanish if its success is built on a shaky foundation. Portugal's history is a powerful lesson in how even the greatest empire can collapse if its success is built on temporary advantages rather than long-term development. It was the first to conquer the ocean, the first to create a global trade network, but it failed to adapt to a changing world. While other nations built factories, advanced science, and strengthened their armies, Portugal relied on the illusion that colonial wealth would last forever. But its rivals were stronger. Spain swallowed it up. England and the Netherlands took its markets, and in 1755, an earthquake delivered the final blow. When Brazil broke away, the truth became undeniable. Without its colonies, Portugal was just a small country in Europe. And so, the once great empire that ruled half the world faded into history.